I was 21 years old when I aged out of the foster care system, standing outside St. Catherine's Home for Children with everything I owned packed into 2 duffel bags and a backpack. I'd spent the last 14 years in the system, bouncing between foster homes and group facilities after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. The social worker, Mrs. Henderson, gave me a sympathetic smile as she handed me an envelope. "This came for you last week from a law office in Vermont," she said. "I almost forgot with everything going on with your transition." Inside was a letter from an attorney named Robert Chambers informing me that my maternal grandmother, Margaret Eleanor Price, had passed away 3 months earlier at the age of 79. I barely remembered her. There had been a few visits when I was very young before my parents died, but after that, nothing. The system had tried to contact her when I entered foster care, but she declined to take custody, claiming she was too old and lived too remotely to care for a child. The rejection had stung back then, and I'd spent years wondering why my own grandmother hadn't wanted me. But according to the letter, she'd left me something in her will. A farm in rural Vermont, complete with 60 acres of land, a farmhouse, a barn, and various outbuildings. There was also a small savings account with about $12,000, which seemed like a fortune to someone who'd never had more than a few $100s at once. The letter instructed me to contact Mr. Chambers to arrange the transfer of the property and to retrieve a package that my grandmother had left specifically for me. I called the number immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed. Mr. Chambers was kind and professional, explaining that the farm had been sitting empty since my grandmother's death, maintained by a local property manager who'd been paid from the estate. "Your grandmother was very specific in her instructions," he told me. "She wanted you to have the farm when you turned 18 or aged out of the system, whichever came first. She also left a letter for you that I'm required to give you in person, along with some other items. We arranged to meet the following week at his office in Burlington, Vermont. I used some of my meager savings to buy a bus ticket, traveling for nearly 12 hours from Ohio to Vermont with my entire life packed around me. I'd never been to Vermont before, and as the bus wound through increasingly rural landscapes, I felt both excited and terrified about what I'd find. Mr. Chambers' office was in a converted Victorian house in downtown Burlington. He was in his mid-60s, with grey hair and warm brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He offered me coffee and settled me into a comfortable chair across from his desk before pulling out a thick file. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he began. "She lived alone on that farm for over 40 years after your grandfather died. She was fiercely independent, maybe too much so for her own good, but she had her reasons for the choices she made." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in shaky handwriting across the front. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in the same unsteady hand. "My dearest child," the letter began, "I imagine you're confused and probably angry about why I never came for you after your parents died. You have every right to those feelings, and I won't insult you by asking for forgiveness. What I can offer you is an explanation and, I hope, a chance at the life your mother would have wanted for you." The letter went on to explain that my grandmother had been estranged from my mother for years before the accident. They'd had a falling out when my mother decided to leave Vermont and marry my father, who my grandmother had disapproved of for reasons she didn't specify. Pride and stubbornness had kept them apart, and by the time my grandmother realized what a mistake she'd made, it was too late. My parents were gone. When social services contacted her about taking custody of me, she'd wanted to say yes desperately, but she'd been 65 years old, living alone on a remote farm with no support system and declining health. She'd convinced herself that I deserved better than an elderly, isolated grandmother who could barely take care of herself, let alone a grieving 7-year-old child. So she'd made what she thought was the selfless choice, and let the system place me with people who might give me a better life. But she'd never stopped thinking about me or feeling guilty about her decision. She'd followed my progress through the years, receiving updates from social services and setting aside money for my future. The farm, she wrote, was my inheritance and my birthright. It had been in our family for 5 generations, and she wanted me to have it, to do with as I wished. If I wanted to sell it and use the money to start a new life elsewhere, she'd understand. But if I wanted to keep it, to build a life there, everything I needed to get started was waiting for me. The letter ended with an apology and a blessing. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to be the grandmother you deserved," she wrote. "But I hope this farm can give you the foundation I failed to provide. There's something waiting for you in the barn, in the tack room at the back. It will explain everything else you need to know." I sat in Mr. Chambers' office, tears streaming down my face as I read and reread the letter, all those years of feeling unwanted and abandoned, and she'd been thinking about me the whole time. It didn't erase the loneliness or the pain, but it shifted something inside me, opening a door I'd kept locked for years. Mr. Chambers gave me privacy to compose myself, returning after a few minutes with a box of tissues and a fresh cup of coffee. When I'd calmed down enough to speak, he handed me a set of keys and a thick folder containing all the property documents, insurance information, and financial records related to the farm. "The property manager's name is Tom Sullivan," he explained. "He's been checking on the place twice a week, making sure everything stays secure and winterized. He's a good man, knew your grandmother for 30 years. He's expecting your call." He also gave me the bank information for the savings account and explained that there was enough money to cover property taxes for at least 2 years, plus basic living expenses if I was careful. "Your grandmother was very thorough in her planning," he said. "She wanted to make sure you had options, not obligations." I thanked him and left his office feeling overwhelmed by the weight of everything I'd learned. I had a grandmother who'd cared about me, even if from a distance. I had property, assets, and possibilities I'd never imagined just 24 hours earlier. But I also had no idea what I was walking into or whether I was capable of handling a farm on my own. I called Tom Sullivan from a coffee shop, and his gruff but friendly voice immediately put me at ease. "Been wondering when I'd hear from you," he said. "Your grandma talked about you all the time, especially toward the end. She had big hopes for what you might do with the place." We arranged to meet at the farm the next morning. I spent that night in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Burlington, barely sleeping as I thought about my grandmother's letter and what might be waiting for me in the barn. The next morning, I took a cab to the address Tom had given me. The farm was about 45 minutes outside Burlington, down increasingly narrow country roads, until we turned onto a gravel driveway marked by a weathered wooden sign that read, "Price Family Farm, Esteda 1892. The farmhouse was a classic New England structure, white clapboard with green shutters and a wraparound porch. It needed paint and some repairs, but the bones were solid. Behind it stood a large red barn that had seen better days, several smaller outbuildings, and fields that stretched into the distance, bordered by stone walls and forest. Tom Sullivan was waiting on the porch, a tall man in his late 50s with weathered skin and kind eyes. He shook my hand firmly and welcomed me like I was family returning home rather than a stranger inheriting property. "Your grandma kept the house pretty basic," he said as he unlocked the front door. "She wasn't one for fancy things, but everything works, and it's clean and dry." The interior was exactly as he'd described, simple furniture, plain walls, and minimal decoration, but it was spacious and filled with afternoon light streaming through large windows. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, a full bathroom that had been updated sometime in the 1980s, and a large country kitchen with an ancient but functional stove. "She spent most of her time out in the barn," Tom continued as we walked back outside. "That's where her real passion was. Come on, I'll show you." We walked across the yard to the barn, and Tom slid open the large doors, revealing an interior that took my breath away. The main area was set up as a workshop, with tools organized neatly on pegboards, workbenches along the walls, and what appeared to be various woodworking projects in different stages of completion. But it was the back section that made me stop in my tracks. The entire rear third of the barn had been converted into a professional furniture-making studio. There were specialized saws, lathes, sanders, and finishing equipment that looked expensive and well-maintained. Shelves held different types of wood, all carefully labeled and stored. And along one wall stood at least a dozen completed pieces of furniture, tables, chairs, cabinets, and decorative items, all crafted with extraordinary skill and attention to detail. "Your grandmother was one of the finest furniture makers in Vermont," Tom said quietly. "Self-taught, started after your grandfather died as a way to cope with grief. Turned out she had a real gift for it. She sold pieces to galleries and collectors all over New England. That's how she supported herself and saved money for you. I walked through the studio in a daze, running my hands over the smooth wood surfaces and examining the intricate joinery. Each piece showed not just technical skill, but artistry and love. This wasn't just furniture, these were works of art. She wanted you to have all of this," Tom continued. "The tools, the wood, the finished pieces, everything. She hoped maybe you'd want to learn the craft, carry it forward. But she also knew you might want to sell it all and do something completely different. Either way, she wanted you to have choices." He led me to the tack room at the back of the barn, a small enclosed space that had been converted into an office. Inside was a desk, a filing cabinet, and several large wooden boxes stacked neatly against the wall. "This is what she mentioned in her letter," Tom said. "She spent her last few months organizing everything for you. Business records, client contacts, tutorials she'd written about different techniques. She even made video recordings of herself explaining various processes in case you wanted to learn." I opened the first box and found it filled with leather-bound journals, each one labeled with dates and topics. Furniture Making Basics, 1985. Advanced Joinery Techniques, 1992. Finishing and Restoration, 2001. There were dozens of them, representing decades of accumulated knowledge and experience. In another box, I found USB drives labeled with video file names, business cards from galleries and collectors, and a ledger showing sales and commissions from the past 20 years. My grandmother had built a successful business, one that was still generating interest, based on the recent emails Tom showed me from potential buyers. She had commissions backed up for months when she got too sick to work, Tom explained. People all over the region know the quality of Price furniture. If you wanted to continue the business, you'd have customers waiting. But like I said, no pressure. This is your inheritance to do with as you please. If you're enjoying this story of unexpected inheritance and hidden family legacies, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to hear in the comments, have you ever discovered something surprising about a family member after they passed away? Or maybe you've inherited something that completely changed your perspective on someone you thought you knew. Share your stories below. This community loves hearing about how the past connects with our present in unexpected ways. I spent the rest of that afternoon going through the contents of the tack room, while Tom showed me around the rest of the property. The land was mostly wooded, with about 15 acres of cleared fields that had once been used for hay, but had been left fallow for the past several years. There was a small orchard of apple trees behind the house, overgrown but still producing fruit. A creek ran through the eastern edge of the property, providing a natural water source and a peaceful soundtrack to the otherwise quiet landscape. Your grandmother leased out the fields to a neighbor for haying up until about 5 years ago, Tom explained. When her arthritis got too bad to maintain the fencing, she let it go. But the soil's still good if you ever wanted to do something with it. As the sun began to set, Tom invited me to his house for dinner to meet his wife, Linda, who had apparently been friends with my grandmother. I accepted gratefully, not wanting to spend my first night alone in the empty farmhouse. Linda Sullivan was a warm, round-faced woman in her mid-50s who hugged me like I was her own grandson the moment we met. She'd prepared a huge meal of pot roast, vegetables, and homemade bread, and as we ate, she shared stories about my grandmother that brought her to life in ways the letter and the barn couldn't. Margaret was stubborn as a mule, Linda said with affection. Once she got an idea in her head, there was no talking her out of it, but she was also the most generous person I've ever known. When Tom broke his leg 6 years ago and couldn't work for 3 months, she hired him to do consulting on her furniture designs, paid him full wages just to sit in her barn and offer opinions. We all knew she didn't need any help, but she found a way to support us without making it feel like charity. She also talked about my grandmother's regret over losing contact with my mother. She talked about your mom all the time, especially in her last years. She kept a photo of her on her workbench, and I'd catch her looking at it when she thought no one was watching. The estrangement ate at her, and when your mom died, I think a part of Margaret died too. She blamed herself terribly. Linda leaned forward, her eyes intense. But she never forgot about you. She followed your life through whatever channels she could, and she planned obsessively for the day you'd age out of the system. This wasn't just about leaving you property. She wanted to give you a foundation, a skill, a way to build a life that would honor your mother's memory. The next morning, I moved into the farmhouse with my 2 duffel bags and backpack, my worldly possessions looking pitifully small in the spacious rooms. Tom had made sure the utilities were on, and the propane tank was full, so I had heat, water, and electricity. The refrigerator was stocked with basic supplies that Linda had insisted on providing, and there was firewood stacked on the porch for the wood stove in the living room. I spent the first few days just exploring and trying to process everything. I walked the property boundaries, sat in the barn looking at the furniture and tools, and read through my grandmother's journals. Her writing was clear and methodical, breaking down complex woodworking techniques into understandable steps. She wrote like a teacher, anticipating questions and providing detailed explanations, but it was the videos that really got to me. Watching her on the laptop I'd borrowed from Tom, I saw a woman in her 70s with silver hair, pulled back in a practical bun, wearing a canvas apron covered in sawdust. Her hands were gnarled with arthritis, but they moved with confidence and precision as she demonstrated various techniques. "If you're watching this," she said in the first video, looking directly into the camera with grey eyes that looked exactly like mine, "then I'm gone, and you're trying to figure out what to do with this mess I've left you. I don't know if you'll want to learn this craft, or if you'll think your crazy old grandmother wasted her time making all these recordings. Either way is fine. I just wanted you to know that you come from a line of makers and creators. Your great-great-grandfather built this barn with his own hands. Your grandfather made the stone walls that still stand on the property. Your mother, God rest her soul, was an incredible artist before she left Vermont. It's in your blood, this need to create something beautiful and lasting. Whether you express it through woodworking or something else entirely, I hope you'll honor that heritage." I watched all 47 videos over the next week, mesmerized by her knowledge and the glimpses of personality that came through. She had a dry sense of humor, often making jokes about her mistakes and the stubborn pieces of wood that refused to cooperate. She also talked about the meditative quality of the work, how losing herself in the process of shaping wood helped her deal with grief, loneliness, and regret. By the end of that first week, I'd made a decision. I was going to stay, at least for a while. I was going to learn this craft that had meant so much to my grandmother, and I was going to see if I had any of the talent she seemed to think ran in the family. I had no other prospects, no job waiting for me anywhere else, and the $12,000 in the bank would support me while I figured things out. Tom was thrilled when I told him my decision. He offered to teach me basic maintenance and repair skills I'd need for the property, and Linda volunteered to help me organize the house and make it feel more like a home. They also introduced me to other neighbors, creating a support network I'd never had before. The local community was small and tight-knit, but they welcomed me as Margaret's grandson, willing to give me a chance to prove myself. I started working in the barn every day, beginning with the simplest projects in my grandmother's tutorials. I learned how to select wood, how to use hand tools safely, how to read grain patterns and work with the natural characteristics of different species. It was frustrating and difficult, nothing like the graceful demonstrations in the videos. I made countless mistakes, wasted expensive wood, and bloodied my knuckles on stubborn pieces. But slowly, incrementally, I began to understand what my grandmother had been trying to teach me. There was something deeply satisfying about working with my hands, about taking raw materials and transforming them into something functional and beautiful. The barn became my sanctuary, a place where the noise in my head quieted and I could focus entirely on the task in front of me. The smell of sawdust, the sound of tools on wood, the satisfaction of a joint that fit perfectly, these things began to heal wounds I didn't even know I had. 3 months into my new life, I completed my first real piece of furniture, a simple side table made from cherry wood. It wasn't perfect by any means. One leg was slightly shorter than the others, requiring a shim, and the finish was uneven in places where I'd applied too much stain. But it was mine, created from start to finish, with my own hands following my grandmother's instructions. I placed it in the living room of the farmhouse, and every time I looked at it, I felt a surge of pride mixed with grief for the woman who'd made this possible. Tom and Linda came over to see it, and Linda actually teared up. "Margaret would be so proud," she said, running her hand over the smooth surface. "She always said you had potential, that creativity would find you if you gave it a chance." As winter settled over Vermont, I fell into a routine. Mornings were spent in the barn, working on increasingly complex projects while following my grandmother's video tutorials. Afternoons, I dedicated to maintenance around the property, learning from Tom how to fix things that broke and prepare for the harsh winter conditions. Evenings I spent reading my grandmother's journals by the fire, often with one of the local cats that had adopted me, a scruffy orange tabby I'd named Sawdust. I was isolated in some ways, living alone on a remote farm with minimal social contact. But I was also more connected than I'd ever been in the foster system. The neighbors checked in regularly, inviting me for meals and offering help with projects beyond my skill level. I started attending a weekly community dinner at the local church, where I met other young people who'd chosen rural life over city opportunities. One of them was Emma Hartley, a 23-year-old woman who'd returned to Vermont after college to start an organic farming operation on her family's land. She was smart, funny, and passionate about sustainable agriculture in a way that reminded me of my own growing passion for woodworking. We started spending time together, and she became my first real friend outside of the foster system, someone who understood the appeal of building something meaningful with your own hands. Emma was fascinated by my grandmother's furniture and the business she'd built. "Do you realize how valuable this knowledge is?" she asked one afternoon as we walked through the barn. "Handcrafted furniture is huge right now, especially pieces made with traditional techniques. People are willing to pay premium prices for quality work that'll last generations." She encouraged me to consider reopening the business, or at least selling some of the finished pieces my grandmother had left behind. I was hesitant, feeling like an imposter trying to profit from work I hadn't done. But Emma helped me see it differently. "Your grandmother created these pieces to be used and appreciated, not to sit in a barn collecting dust. Selling them honors her work and funds your education in the craft. It's a bridge between her legacy and your future." With Emma's help, I contacted several of the galleries and clients from my grandmother's records. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Apparently, Margaret Price Furniture had a reputation for exceptional quality, and collectors were eager to acquire her final pieces. Within 2 weeks, I'd sold 6 items for a total of $17,000, more money than I'd ever imagined possessing. The sales gave me financial breathing room and validated that my grandmother's work had real value in the marketplace. But more importantly, the conversations with buyers taught me about the business side of furniture making, pricing, marketing, building client relationships, and understanding what customers valued. On collector, an elderly man named Harrison Wells from Boston drove up to the farm specifically to see the remaining pieces. He was a connoisseur who'd been collecting my grandmother's work for 15 years, and he spent hours in the barn examining each piece with reverence. "Your grandmother was an artist," he said. "These aren't just functional objects. They're statements about craftsmanship, patience, and respect for materials. In a world of mass production and planned obsolescence, her work represented something timeless." He asked if I was planning to continue the business, and I admitted I was still learning the craft. He smiled and handed me his card. "When you're ready to sell your own work, contact me. I'd be honored to be your first customer. Talent like this runs in families, and from what I've seen of your practice pieces out back, you've inherited more than just property." His words stayed with me, building my confidence as I continued to learn and practice. By the time spring arrived, I'd completed a dozen smaller projects and was ready to attempt something more ambitious. A dining table in walnut, using one of my grandmother's more advanced designs. The project took me 6 weeks of intense work, and there were moments when I thought I'd bitten off more than I could chew. The joinery was complex, requiring precision I wasn't sure I possessed. The finish needed to be perfect to showcase the beautiful grain patterns, and the whole time I was acutely aware that I was attempting to create something worthy of the price name. Emma helped me through the frustrating moments, offering encouragement and occasionally just sitting with me in the barn while I worked. "You're not trying to be your grandmother," she reminded me during one particularly difficult evening. "You're becoming your own kind of craftsman, building on her foundation but bringing your own vision to the work." When I finally completed the table, it was better than I'd dared hope. The proportions were balanced, the joinery was tight, and the finish glowed with depth and richness. It wasn't perfect, there were small imperfections that an expert would notice, but it was solid, beautiful, and entirely functional. Tom and Linda came to see it, along with Emma and several other neighbors. We celebrated with dinner around the table, christening it with laughter and good food. It was the first time the farmhouse had hosted a gathering since my grandmother's death, and I could almost feel her approval in the warm atmosphere. "This is just the beginning," Tom said as we sat around my creation. "Your grandmother left you the tools and knowledge, but you're the one doing the work. You're the one choosing to honor her legacy while building your own. That takes courage, especially for someone who's had to figure out life on their own." His words hit me harder than he probably intended. I had been on my own for most of my life, learning to be self-sufficient because I had no choice. But here, in this community, with these people who'd embraced me as one of their own, I was discovering what it meant to belong somewhere. The farm wasn't just property I'd inherited, it was becoming home. As my first year on the farm drew to a close, I reflected on how much had changed since that day I'd stood outside St. Catherine's home with my duffel bags and uncertain future. I'd gone from having nothing and no one to owning land, possessing valuable skills, and being part of a community that cared about me. The transformation wasn't just external. Something fundamental had shifted inside me as well. The anger and resentment I'd carried for years about being abandoned had softened into understanding. Reading my grandmother's journals and letters, I'd come to see her not as the cold woman who'd rejected me, but as a flawed human being who'd made difficult choices based on fear and self-doubt. She'd convinced herself I'd be better off without her, just as I'd convinced myself for years that I was better off not needing anyone. We'd both been wrong, but at least she'd found a way to reach across the gap she'd created and offer me something valuable. The farm had given me more than financial security or a roof over my head. It had given me purpose, identity, and a connection to a family history I'd never known existed. Every time I worked in the barn, I felt linked to generations of creators and makers, people who'd understood that the work of your hands could be a form of love and legacy. I started taking on small commissions, nothing too ambitious yet, but enough to build a portfolio and reputation. Word spread through the local community, and then beyond that, Margaret Price's grandson was carrying on the tradition. Clients came to the farm to discuss projects, to see my work, and to share stories about pieces my grandmother had made for them decades earlier. One woman brought in a rocking chair my grandmother had built in 1987, asking if I could restore it. As I worked on the piece, carefully repairing joints and refinishing surfaces worn smooth by years of use, I felt an intimate connection to my grandmother's hands, which had shaped this same wood 35 years earlier. The work became a meditation on continuity, on how the things we create outlive us and touch lives we'll never know about. Emma and I grew closer throughout that first year, our relationship evolving from friendship into something deeper. She understood the pull of the land and the satisfaction of creating something with your own effort. We'd spend evenings planning our respective futures, dreaming about the possibilities that rural life offered for people willing to work hard and think creatively. "What if we combined our operations eventually?" she suggested one night as we sat on the farmhouse porch watching fireflies. "Your furniture business and my farming. We could create a destination, a place where people come to buy handcrafted furniture and organic produce, maybe even host workshops teaching traditional skills. There's a whole market of people looking for authentic, sustainable alternatives to mass-produced everything." The idea excited me, this vision of building something larger than myself while staying true to the values my grandmother had embodied. We started making plans, careful not to rush, but allowing ourselves to imagine a shared future. By the end of my second year on the farm, I'd established a steady business making custom furniture. I wasn't getting rich, but I was making a comfortable living, doing work I loved, and the demand kept growing. I'd also started teaching occasional workshops, sharing my grandmother's techniques with others who wanted to learn traditional woodworking. Teaching forced me to articulate what I'd learned and to understand the craft at a deeper level. The property itself had transformed as well. With Emma's help, I'd restored the apple orchard and started a large vegetable garden. We'd repaired fences and began leasing the fields again, this time to Emma's organic farming operation. The land that had sat dormant during my grandmother's final years was coming back to life, productive and purposeful once more. Tom and Linda had become like grandparents to me, filling a role I'd never expected to have in my life. They celebrated my successes, offered advice when I struggled, and provided the kind of unconditional support I'd always craved but never experienced. Linda taught me to cook using vegetables from my own garden, and Tom showed me how to maintain the old tractor and equipment my grandmother had left behind. On the second anniversary of my arrival at the farm, I did something I'd been planning for months. I took one of the first pieces of walnut my grandmother had carefully stored and set aside, wood she'd been saving for a special project, and I created a memorial bench. I carved her name and dates into the backrest along with a simple inscription: "She built with her hands and taught with her heart." I placed the bench under the old maple tree beside the barn, where my grandmother used to sit and rest between projects. It became a place where I'd go to think, to remember, and to feel connected to the woman whose choices had given me this unexpected life. Sometimes I'd sit there and talk to her, telling her about my latest project or sharing news about the community she'd loved. It sounds crazy, but in those moments, I felt her presence, not as a ghost, but as a continuing influence on who I was becoming. I also started reaching out to other former foster kids who'd aged out of the system, offering internships and apprenticeships at the farm. I knew what it felt like to face adulthood with no support system and limited opportunities, and I wanted to pay forward the gift my grandmother had given me. Over the next few years, I taught a dozen young people basic woodworking and property maintenance skills, giving them a safe place to figure out their next steps while earning money and learning valuable trades. Some stayed for a few months before moving on to other opportunities. Others, like James, a talented 19-year-old with a natural gift for design, became permanent parts of the operation. Watching them gain confidence and discover their own capabilities became one of the most rewarding aspects of my life at the farm. 3 years after inheriting the property, Emma and I got married in a ceremony held in the barn, surrounded by furniture my grandmother had made and pieces I'd created. Tom walked me down the aisle, since I had no father to perform the duty, and Linda cried through the entire service. The community turned out in force, celebrating not just our union, but the way two young people had chosen to build a life rooted in tradition, craft, and connection to the land. We converted one of the outbuildings into a farm store, selling my furniture alongside Emma's produce and value-added products like jams and pickles. The business grew beyond what either of us had imagined, attracting customers from across New England who appreciated quality, authenticity, and the story behind what they were buying. Looking back now, 5 years after receiving that letter from Mr. Chambers, I'm amazed by the journey. I went from being a kid with nothing, standing outside an orphanage with my life in 2 duffel bags, to being a skilled craftsman, a husband, a property owner, and a mentor to others facing similar challenges. The farm that my grandmother left me wasn't just land and buildings. It was possibility, purpose, and proof that our choices matter, even when we can't see their full impact. My grandmother spent years regretting the choice she'd made to let me go into the system, but in the end, she'd given me something far more valuable than childhood custody would have provided. She'd given me skills, resources, and a foundation to build an authentic life on my own terms. She taught me that it's never too late to reach out, to try to make things right, and to invest in someone else's future. And most importantly, she'd shown me that family isn't just about who raises you, it's about who believes in you and gives you the tools to become who you're meant to be. Thank you so much for listening to this story about unexpected inheritance, second chances, and the healing power of meaningful work. If you enjoyed this journey from the orphanage to the farm, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. I'd absolutely love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever discovered an unexpected talent or passion later in life? Maybe someone invested in you in a way that changed your trajectory, or perhaps you've had the chance to pay forward a gift someone gave you. Share your experiences with our community. We're all here learning from each other's journeys. And here's a question to reflect on. What's the most important lesson you took away from this story? Was it about forgiveness, about the value of traditional skills, about finding belonging, or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts below. Your stories and insights make this community special, and I read every single comment. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.